I mean, guilty of what? Well, what I'm guilty of doing is disagreeing with the stance of Indiana Ministries, which is a kind of dissent. And if I think about dissent, I think, well, what is more Protestant and really what is more Church of God than, to some extent, dissent? There would not be a Protestant church without dissent.
Welcome, everyone, to episode 2 of season 2 of CHOGAffirm Conversations. I am Nick Dawn. I'm here with Karma, and I will let Karma introduce our fantastic guest for this episode.
Yeah, we're so glad to have Sam Collins, who is a friend and colleague and co-sojourner, I guess, on this journey. Sam is third-generation Church of God. He graduated from Anderson University in 1973, earned his MDiv from Anderson School of Theology in 1976, and spent 34 years in National Church of God offices in roles that always included writing and editing. He was a feature columnist for Vital Christianity for 17 years. He signed the CHOGAffirm statement in 2023. Indiana Ministries revoked his credentials in January 2025. Sam has written extensively through the credentialing process, and we're so thankful for that. A formal response to the investigation questions, a statement to the investigation team, an opening statement to the DMS, and a public letter to the National Committee on Credentialing that has circulated widely. These documents are true Sam Collins style, sharp, funny, theologically grounded, and deeply Church of God in their sensibility. They are the work of a professional writer and a lifelong churchman who knows exactly what he's doing with language.
So what do you have to say to that, Sam?
Well, I feel like I'm at my own funeral.
And so we remember Sam.
Yeah, well, makes me sound better than I think I am, but thank you.
Well, Sam, we want to proceed, I guess, roughly chronologically across this. So let's start with growing up. What did the Church of God feel like to you growing up, and then what drew you to ministry in the Church of God?
My family connection to Church of God started through my grandmother, maternal grandmother, back in the early 20th century. She went to a sawdust tent revival in Tennessee, went forward and was Church of God the rest of the way. So she kind of drugged the rest of the family into the Church of God, and in many ways was the force that kept the family in the Church of God in my early years. My father was not a professing Christian for many years. My grandfather was far from a professing Christian. And my mother, she went because my grandmother drug her there and eventually became a part of the church as well. So my earliest recollection of my time in the Church of God was at Larchmont Church of God in Louisville, Kentucky. Long-standing congregation, but we were there until I was about 5, and then we moved to New Albany, moved to southern Indiana when I was 5. And so that was a congregation that nurtured me. I was a rather socially awkward child, just as I've grown into be a rather socially awkward adult. But there were people there who took an interest in me. And they began to, I think, see things in myself that I didn't necessarily see in myself. They encouraged me to ask questions. They encouraged me to explore what the biblical story meant for my own life, and to even question part of the biblical story itself. Asked some questions that maybe some people would have seen as uncomfortable. So it was helpful to have that kind of background and people in my life. I eventually began to sense some form of call, and I even hesitate to call it a call. And I say that because I know some people who can say very definitely, I felt the strong move of God saying, you need to go into the ministry. I would characterize my call to the ministry a little more like I heard Frederick Buechner, Presbyterian minister, talk about his spiritual experiences and the voice of God. And he described it as a kind of rustling of leaves in a tree in the wind, that you sense something moving, and at that moment, something seems to be saying something to you. But even looking back, you ask yourself, is that really what it said? Is that really what the voice, even though it wasn't an audible voice, was saying to me? He wrestled with that throughout his life, about key moments in his life, and I have to admit, I kind of do that as well. I sensed a call. I felt that call, have felt that call throughout my life, but it's always been a call that I've somewhat struggled with and asked myself, did I hear it right back then? And am I hearing it right now? But after that, I felt enough of a sense of call to decide to go to seminary. Now, I graduated from SOT at Anderson, but I didn't start out at SOT. I started out at Christian Theological Seminary in Indianapolis. And the reason I did that was in '73, when I was graduating from college, there was a controversy in the General Assembly of some association with the School of Theology in Anderson with Christian Theological Seminary. And there were some pastors who, whatever the details of that were not in favor of that. In fact, they were adamantly opposed. One of the people who was adamantly opposed was Sister Lily McCutcheon. And you know, when Sister Lily was adamantly opposed to something, she was adamantly opposed. And she made this speech: we need to stay away from an association with Christian Theological Seminary because, for one thing, they have Catholics teaching on staff. They're not Church of God. They don't have our theology. She just painted a pretty bleak picture. And I sat there thinking to myself, can that place really be that bad? And I said to myself, you know, I really would like to see this place for myself. I'd like to compare what I'm hearing about it with what I experienced. And so, kind of out of the blue, I applied to Christian Theological Seminary and went there for the first year and loved it.
Let's switch gears a little bit and look forward to after you've graduated. You've worked at the national offices for a while, and then you're an editor for Warner Press. That's where I first met you. I was a young college student at Mid-America Christian University, and I came in to start working for Warner Press as an author for college-age curriculum. But you were also, for a number of years, a regular contributor to Vital Christianity. What was it like writing for Vital Christianity, and what is your sense of the role that Vital Christianity played in the movement? And do you think there's anything that fulfills that function today?
I'll answer the last question first and then back up a bit. No, I don't think anything fulfills that role, and I think that's part of our problem at this point. I think one of the roles it served during that time was to create a place where different voices could express themselves and be heard, where a certain discussion and dialogue could take place. The reason I started writing and how I started writing was even before I came to the national offices, right out of seminary, I went into the pastorate for a brief time, 4 years, but it wasn't a place where I felt entirely comfortable. Again, enough of an introvert that there was a bit of dis-ease in the pulpit. But writing, I think I always have thought better on my seat than on my feet. And writing allowed me to do that.
That's another parallel. That's another parallel with you and Frederick Buechner.
Yeah. And I'd always been, as an only child, I'd always been a reader. I loved to read. And so that, I think, helped fuel some of my writing as well. But I found that the people who were at Bible Christianity at the time that I started writing allowed me a degree of liberty in choosing my own subject matter and the way I approached that subject matter that somewhat surprised me. I tried to utilize humor, which wasn't always something that was a heavy part of violent Christianity in those days. In fact, got some blowback, especially in the early days.
Interesting.
But they also let me deal with issues that I had questions about that some people might have felt at least a little bit controversial, that were a little bit controversial. And so that, I think, helped not only my writing, but it also helped me have a different feeling about things that I could begin to explore and even ask more questions about. But I really do think that vital Christianity, especially with the editorial staff that they had at one point, encouraged questioning, encouraged exploration. It, until its demise, was one of the few places where some of those discussions could take place. And now that it no longer exists, and now that I think the General Assembly continues to be pretty structured and structured, there aren't really many places where that kind of free-floating discussion and exploration can take place.
Yeah, Karma, do you want to?
Yes, I want to say two things. I appreciate what you're saying. It was something we had in common, and that's missing now. Also, I remember one of your pieces was about women in leadership, and it had your classic gorgeous humor infused in it, and it was very, very affirming to me as a woman in leadership within the church. So yeah, thank you for that, friend.
I'd probably like to read it at some point because there's so many things I wrote over the years. I have no recollection.
Yeah, so you had these years of leading and speaking into the life of the church through Vital Christianity and through the national offices, and over time, you're thinking about LGBTQ plus people and inclusion within the church and the church's official stances that were recorded in GA history. You found yourself at a different place than the national offices had stated and the church in general had stated. How did that thinking emerge and evolve over time? What were the influences?
Well, let me say from the outset, I think I was late to articulating what my stance was on those issues. And I say that because I began to have questions way before the CHOGAffirm statement
Of course.
and the time that I placed my signature there. In fact, I go beyond that and say it wasn't just questions I had. I'd come in my own mind to the point where I felt LGBTQ plus people, their exclusion from full inclusion and the acknowledged life and activity of the church and leadership in the church, including ordained ministry, was not something that I really felt was supported by the Spirit of Christ and what I would call and other people have called the kind of the arc of the revelation of the Bible. Part of where I came to was seeing the Bible not as a carved on stone tablets, rigid book that we memorize and that we say on specific questions, well, this is what the Bible says about it, and then that's the end of discussion. I began to see the Bible not as a discussion stopper, but as a discussion starter. That what it does is it invites us into the biblical story, the biblical witness, and what the best of the Bible does, which is begin to explore what it means to be the people of God, what it means to be in relationship with God, And who or what is this God that we say we worship? What God really calls us to do is walk alongside God in the unfolding revelation that God has for us. You know, there's this idea that the New Testament, for example, is God's final revelation. In fact, I heard somebody say, I read recently somebody, and this is within the Church of God, said that the New Testament should not be called the New Testament, it should be called the final testament. Mm. And I really think that makes of the Bible, both the Old and New Testament, it makes them dead books. And I think they're living books. And I hate to use the word evolving books because I know evolution has negative connotations for many people. But I think it's a book where at least our understanding of what it calls us to evolves, grows, and even changes to some extent. As the Spirit interacts with us individually and as it interacts with us corporately as the body of Christ. So that ways that we saw the Bible way back when don't necessarily become the ways that we see the Bible today. And I mean, there are instances other than LGBTQ plus issues, especially in the Church of God, where that certainly isn't the case. Dancing, for example, was a verboten thing in the early Church of God. Well, Anderson University had dance as a major. Coffee was considered the devil's brew. I don't know of a pastor that probably doesn't, that could pass the Starbucks breathalyzer test these days. So, you know, we've changed how we view holiness continually in the Church of God over the years. And I think where this issue is concerned, we haven't taken seriously seriously enough the Church of God hasn't, or much of the Church of God hasn't taken seriously enough, the call to say, we really need to wrestle with this. We need to ask ourselves, what is the Bible really saying? And who are these people that we are stereotyping and denigrating? I think one of the things that changed me the most was not just as I wrestled with a biblical passage, but it was to get to know LGBTQ plus people and to find that they did not, in most ways, conform to the very negative stereotypes that had been promulgated by them. These were not promiscuous people. These were people who were longing for relationship, many of them committed relationship. These were people who were not driven by their own physical desires. They were driven by a desire to know God, to honor God, to be Christ followers, to be shaped in the image of Christ. And so more and more, it seemed to me that where the Church of God was not a place that I found myself being. Mm-hmm. But it also was not always a key issue that I focused on. Well, I wouldn't say it wasn't a key issue, but it wasn't an issue that I focused on until years went by and I began to meet more and more people who were LGBTQ plus, and I finally came to the point where I said, you know, I need to not only be in this position inside myself and in private conversations, but I was asked by one of the people who was instrumental in the CHOGAffirm statement if I'd be willing to consider signing. And, you know, I pretty quickly said I was at the point where I could say, yeah, I think I need to make a public stand. Now, I didn't have any misapprehensions about what I thought would take place once I signed. I figured when I signed, I was signing my signature and it was going to mean I'd lose my credentials. But I decided I'm willing to do that at this point. But again, I wouldn't give myself a merit badge because it felt like it took me too long to get to that point.
Yeah, and I think many of us have that experience. I'm 70, and I feel like I had some, well, I know I had some excellent influence to an inclusive understanding from the time I was in at AC, back in AC days in the 70s.
Right.
And that was a thread that underscored, but it was very under the radar, and my language was inarticulate, kind of echoing what you have said. It took me quite a while to be able to articulate and be able to say, this is wrong, and this does not coincide with the gospel that I know, and the Jesus that I know, and the Trinity that I know, and I need to be honest about that with my faith nest.
It more and more felt like it was dishonest about where I was, but it was dishonest about the makeup of the churches that I knew. I mean, there's a tendency in some places in the Church of God to pretend that LGBTQ people are not a part of current congregations, or if they are, they're kept out of leadership. Well, we have people who are leading who just have not felt the liberty to be honest about who they are and articulate it. But if you pulled out many of the people who are LGBTQ plus out of our congregations, we'd have a significant, I think, leadership vacuum in some places. And that's a thing that I think the church knows at some level, but they will not acknowledge.
Yes, silence is more comfortable and chosen.
Well, I don't think we need to walk step by step through the process after you signed, and as you had kind of expected, a decredentialing effort began taking place in Indiana and elsewhere. But one thing that stood out to me in your response to being called before the board and asked if you pled guilty or not guilty to the charges, and you refused to plead either, and instead you described yourself as a dissenter. What did you mean by that? What's the difference between dissenting and pleading guilty or not guilty to the charges?
Well, there were a couple things that brought me to that point. One was I didn't end up getting called before the investigative team until later than some of the other folks. And having heard other people's experiences, I knew that's a question that was going to come up. But the more I thought about it, the more I thought, that's a wholly inappropriate question. It implies something that I don't think is fair to the people who are being questioned. It implies some kind of infraction. I mean, guilty of what? Well, what I'm guilty of doing is disagreeing with the stance of Indiana Ministries, which is a kind of dissent. And if I think about dissent, I think, well, what is more Protestant and really what is more Church of God than, to some extent, dissent? There would not be a Protestant church without dissent. The Church of God was born out of dissent. D.S. Warner disagreeing about especially matters of holiness and unity with the Weinbrunarian Church of which he was a part. And so dissent's been a part of that history. And dissent means that basically we can disagree with something that we see happening within the church at the time, that there could be a diversity of opinion. And so, what I basically said was, I refuse to plead guilty or not guilty. That makes it sound like I'm guilty of some kind of moral infraction, that I'm sacrificing pets on an altar in the church basement, some kind of morally reprehensible activity. I refuse to put it in those terms. What I will say is that I dissent and that I'm non-compliant with where Indiana Ministries wishes me to be on this particular issue, on these particular principles. I dissent on that. I dissent on the way the Bible is being interpreted. I dissent from the assumption that we can't be in fellowship unless we totally agree with one another. I dissent from the view that my disagreeing with you means that I have to cut you off from fellowship with me, and that we can't have an ongoing discussion about what are some gray areas of theology, belief, and practice, and that we can't continue to live in those gray areas and have hard discussions about them, which I really think is what we're called to do in the church. We're not called to totally agree, to walk in lockstep. What we're called to do is challenge one another, certainly, question one another, but be supportive in that challenging and questioning so that we begin to talk enough, understand one another's positions enough, and stay humble enough that we together discuss those issues and keep our ears cocked to the Holy Spirit to try to see what the Holy Spirit might be saying to us at a given time.
And then, following the official decision by Indiana Ministries to revoke your credentials, you then wrote an open letter primarily to the National Committee on Credentialing, in which you said you did not expect an appeal to work, and so you're not filing an official appeal, but you are asking some questions.
It's pretty powerful, your list, Sam, of the representation of different roles and offices held by those whose credentials have been revoked. You had a long list: 4 national ministry staff members, 2 national ministry and international missions, and on and on and on and on. It's like 10 different things. And as you say in your document, that only scratches the surface. You're listing people that were very effectively serving in those roles, people that, as you said in what you're just talking about, had no moral failure, had no real need for disciplinary action. Their failure was to comply with Indiana State Ministries. So that was powerful to me. And then you asked a lot of questions, Sam, in that document. You have a long list of questions, and I don't know if you can bring those to mind or if you have that document in front of you, but I think, maybe you could highlight a few of those questions that you posed to the credentialing committee.
I probably got my file here. Well, I think the questions as I recall them, and I've got the document here in front of me, I think are still ones that I think, to me, are ones that I'd like addressed, and I don't know that they've really been addressed. Well, I know they haven't been addressed adequately as far as I'm concerned, but I'm not sure how much they've been addressed at all. But one of them, for example, is how can we assure that something like this heretic headhunting and decredentialing, how can we be sure this doesn't happen again?
Yeah.
And I know after the first group that were decredentialed, there haven't been as many, but as I understand it, there are still people who are being questioned.
Yes.
And losing their credentials.
Yes.
And one of my questions was, how can we be sure something like this doesn't happen again? That good people, gifted people, and people who display what I would say is one of the essentials of being a minister, which were never addressed in the questioning. One of the essentials, which is, how do these people reflect the gifts of the Spirit? I don't think any of us who were questioned in the credentials process, I don't think they really looked at or cared about whether these people displayed love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, generosity, self-control. In fact, in my situation, they made it pretty clear they didn't want to hear about any of that. I think you brought a witness with you to kind of talk about your ministry.
Yeah, I did.
They restricted me from doing that.
Right, because of me.
I think so. Yeah,
I brought a barrage of witnesses. Yeah.
Yeah, well, and they didn't want to deal with that. They wanted.
Yeah.
It was a one issue trial, really, and that was, do you support LGBTQ plus inclusion or not? I would hope something like that never happens again, but it continues to happen. The other questions were, what can be done to create an atmosphere that makes room for and even encourages honest discourse, dissent, diversity, and freedom of conscience, where innovative, creative, courageous, ordained ministers need not fear retribution for openly asking questions and stating non-majority opinions. Because it seems to me that one of the things we want to encourage in ministry should be a kind of creativity and inquisitiveness. Not that we learn rote answers to theological questions, but that we try to push boundaries. And as one minister I heard say, to put forward the gospel of Jesus Christ, we need to risk heresy.
Wow.
And I think that's the case. Again, our tradition would say that we value people who were considered heretics by other people. D.S. Warner among them, Martin Luther among them. And so are we saying now that willingness to ask those kinds of questions, to explore that kind of territory, to see where God is calling us, that's now ended? That seems to be what this whole process has been saying. These kind of discussions need to take place. And this kind of thing squelches that. I think there are people out there in the church, not just ministers, but people in the pews, who are supportive of people who are pro-LGBTQ plus inclusive. But I think this kind of credentialing the heretic hunting process makes those people fearful to speak up and be very plain about that. And I think that's a detriment to the church. There needs to be a mechanism, I think, in the church, a venue where those kinds of discussions can take place, not just about this issue, but a number of issues that are facing the church and the church is going to have to face in the years ahead. And I don't see that platform at this point, that venue, being discussed, much less create.
Yeah, I think it's going to be a real problem for any kind of voluntary association to also want to be a high control organization, right? And in a lot of ways, that captures the critique of D.S. Warner against hierarchy and organization, right? Man-made organizations trying to be high control organizations are squelching the individual relationship to God and the work of the Spirit, right? That's kind of the central D.S. Warner critique.
Right, and so that really means that this whole process is a very non-Church of God process. It is trying to be very high control, at least a very high control about a certain area.
So in those questions, obviously, those are questions that you would like to hear answers about. And I think that it's important for the sustainability of the Church of God at a national and global level to at least, even if they don't provide answers to you, to at least be able to answer those kinds of questions. Because in the absence of that, there's just a lot of disunity that's produced. So you would hope that they would be able to provide answers to that. And obviously those questions are reflective of hopes you would have for the Church of God generally. If we broaden that out a little bit, what do you hope for the Church of God, or what would you want the Church of God to look like, say, 10 years from now?
Well, I think I'm a poor prognosticator. I think it has to do more with spirit almost than even particular specifics. One of my key wishes is that the church could see it as a church in process, not a church that has defined what it is for all times and all purposes, and then sets out to defend that, push that, promulgate that. But it sees itself as a church that is open, that preaches love, that preaches exploration, that preaches inquisitiveness, that preaches the ongoing, vibrant, creative thing that I think the Spirit of God is. I guess the best image I could come up with, more than a concrete image of we're doing this, we're doing that, we believe this, we believe that, is a yeasty church that's bubbling, but not bubbling with hostility and bubbling with can'ts, but a church that is bubbling in terms of interacting and relating to one another in ways that are caring, open, well, inquisitive is the best term I can come up with. And I know that sounds pretty nonspecific, and it is. And I know it's a kind of haziness and fuzziness that some people would be extremely uncomfortable with. But I'm not sure it's not very similar to what I see as the Spirit of Christ that we see in much of the New Testament. You know, Jesus kept getting asked questions. They kept trying to pin him down. And what he very often did was he responded with a question, to a question with a question, which really was an invitation, again, to dialogue. And unfortunately, I think that's a part of the Spirit of Christ that we tend to have put on the back burner. It's a hard one for us to feel comfortable with.
That inspires me, Sam, to hear you describe that. And we know that takes a lot of humility in leadership.
And it takes patience.
Yeah.
I mean, it takes hard work.
Yeah.
What I'm talking about is not easy. It's highly frustrating, actually.
Yeah.
But relationship is frustrating. It pushes us. Anybody who's ever been married knows that you live in gray areas all the time.
Think of how God feels. God's experiencing our hazy relationship with God.
One of the things God says repeatedly in the Bible is, well, this is what you thought I wanted, but you were wrong.
Yeah.
Actually, what I wanted was this.
Yeah.
Your thoughts are not my thoughts. Your ways are not my ways. And I think too often in the church and in religious institutions as a whole, we think we finally got it figured out. And so it's our job from now on to tell everybody what God wants and God thinks, rather than to continually ask ourselves the question, what could we possibly have gotten wrong? What are we possibly missing? Where has our arrogance and our ego, where has it taken us off track, and where has it closed us off from other people and the people who need God's love, God's understanding, God's relationship?
So one final question, Sam, before we let you go. You said earlier that you have a sense of you feel like maybe it took you longer than you would have preferred to publicly say something, right? What would you say to someone in a Church of God congregation right now who agrees with you, but who also hasn't said anything publicly?
Well, I certainly wouldn't be prescriptive. I think what I would say to that person is keep dealing with that issue. If you're feeling a tug, if you're thinking, I can't really be where I see the Church of God being at this point, I'd say keep dealing with that issue and asking yourself, do I need to be more forthright? And if I do, at what place does that need to take place? To be somewhat gentle with themselves and to also find ways in the interim of being in relationship and conversation with people who are in the LGBTQ plus community and being sensitive to what is going on in their lives and to listen to both what they are saying and to what that individual's, the person who's struggling, who's come to the conclusion that they feel more inclusive but haven't articulated it, to ask themselves, what am I feeling? What am I thinking? And where can I give, if I'm not ready to come out totally publicly, where can I come, where can I make where I am known and articulated with people that I trust in private situations so that I can begin to articulate what that stance is, because we each come to this in our own ways, and we have to ask ourselves, where are we personally, emotionally at the time? What can we emotionally handle in terms of feedback at a given time? I can think of times in my own life when I was dealing with mental health issues, for example, depression.
Yeah.
When I, number one, had to take care of myself.
Yes.
And if people had a lot of pushback about this issue or any number of issues, I would have had a hard time coping with it. So I don't know what another person is dealing with in terms of the totality of their life situation. So that's the reason it's difficult for me to be prescriptive.
Yeah.
I would hope that a whole raft of people could get to the point where they could be upfront and could articulate their support for the affirmation of LGBTQ plus people and inclusion. I would hope many more people could begin to talk about that. But, it would depend on who I was talking to at the time and what I sensed about their readiness to do that and their emotional equipment and energy to be able to do that at the time, what I would suggest they might do.
Yeah. And we have received lots of stories from both allies and members of the queer community of that unreadiness, they're just not ready for all the reasons you're suggesting. Yeah,
well, I've heard stories about a preacher a long time ago who said you got to be able to look at the sky, see what the conditions are. Maybe there's a storm coming in. Maybe the season's about to change. Which I take to mean you got to know your own context, right?
Yeah.
But he never just came out and said things like that. He'd always have some story to tell or. Well, Sam, thank you. I always appreciate getting to hear from you. Always appreciate getting to spend some time with you. Thank you for the gifts that you have given to the church in writing in so many ways over the years and continue to do for those of us fortunate enough to be on your Facebook friends list. And thank you for spending time with us today.
Thank you, Sam. It means so much. Means so much.